Well, we come now to the 12th kind of installment of this Mass in Slow Motion. I want to focus a little bit on the liturgy of the Word. It was mentioned a little bit in our last video and flyer about the liturgy of the Word in general, but I want to focus on it because it has some special qualities about it and that make it stand out a bit. It's a reading. It is that. It's done ideally from the pulpit. Even if it's sung by a cantor, ideally the cantor moves to the pulpit to sing it. So it's a reading, but it's more than a reading. It's a sung prayer. It becomes, the Psalm book, of course, the book of Psalms is the great prayer book of ancient Israel, and it contains every human emotion. And so, having heard the first reading, the people then are hearing yet they're hearing a reading, but they're also involved in it because ideally they're at least reciting an antiphon and maybe singing along an antiphon with the cantor, and then the verses that are either said or sung. So, it's a reading, but it's also a prayer. And that's its uniqueness. With that in mind, a little bit of a history of this psalm. The way we do it today is pretty similar to the way it was done in the very earliest days of the ancient church in the first four centuries, maybe 5 centuries. There was what we have today, an antiphon, and then the verses of the psalm would be sung. And it was generally sung, but it could also be recited, but there would be an antiphon sung by the people. And then a cantor or a lector or someone would either recite or more often than not sing the verses of the psalm. Now, one difference is that even for the lengthier psalms, the entire psalm would be sung, all the verses. Whereas now, if there's a very lengthy psalm, one of them goes for over 100 verses, the 119th psalm, there's a selection that's made, that not the entire psalm is sung. So usually it's 4 or 5 verses of a psalm would be the most we would do. But basically, our format today is the most ancient format. Now you'll see when we look at the history a bit here that began to change, we start to see that. We've gotten back now to the more ancient format, but over the many centuries, a lot of things began to fall away, and the responsorial psalm got shorter at one level and briefer, as we'll see. But today, there remains just the usual processes that we just use the psalm, antiphon, and verses, either read by the cantor or not, and the antiphon is either said or sung by the congregation. And again, if it is sung, a cantor will often take that role. Now, with that in mind, there are other options. However, one is permitted to sing a gradual from the book of graduals. I'll talk about the meaning of that word in a minute, but it's basically an antiphon, just an antiphon, and maybe one verse of the psalm. And it's called the Graduale Romanum, the Roman gradual, and that's an option even today to draw from that. There's also, because those chants tend to be extremely elaborate and hard to sing, even by trained musicians, there's a simple gradual that is sometimes used as well. Generally, however, almost everywhere you go, you're going to have the responsorial psalm the way we're used to it. A cantor or a lector says or sings the antiphon, the people respond, and then verses are done, the antiphon is recited, and so on. We're all familiar with it. All right. Now, as I said, this is the way it was in the early church. However, it's in the early church, things began to happen after, say, about the 5th or 6th century, whereby the number of verses of the psalm began to be shortened and things began. So it is the psalm was sung, as I said, in the early church. The lector or cantor would go, and instead of going all the way up into the pulpit, there was a habit commonly of staying on one of the steps of the pulpit. And you might say, well, why would that be? Well, there was a special honor given to the gospel that it was proclaimed on the highest point of the pulpit. And this was not everywhere, but it was widespread enough that this term gradual got kind of attached to what we call today the responsorial psalm. And by the way, you'll see in a minute, we often misunderstand what we mean by that phrase, the responsorial psalm, and I'll show you that in a moment. So this word gradual began to be attached to the what we today call the responsorial psalm, because the lector or cantor stood on the gradus, or the step of the pulpit, not necessarily all the way up to the top. Today we don't. We just, you go into the pulpit, you go up to the reading desk, and everyone goes up to the top of the pulpit. But that said, there were times where this wasn't done, and that's why the word gradual sometimes is applied to what we today call the responsorial psalm. But there's some changes began to happen then. The antiphons started to become more and more elaborate. Now, why was this, you say? If you want the people to sing it, shouldn't be simple and straightforward. And the answer is yes. But I'm a musician, church musician myself. I'm not a composer, but I'm a musician. I play the organ, and I was a choir director for many years, and I can tell you right now, if a musician can make something more and more elaborate, they tend to do it. There's a lot of musicians easily get bored with simple things, and they start to elaborate. And this happened with the antiphons that people were being asked to sing more and more. They became more and more difficult, more elaborate. They became longer. And so the people began to sort of become, it was more of a listening event, while a choir of trained singers would carry on these very elaborate melodies. And so this started to then shorten the number of psalm verses that were used, and they began to increasingly disappear, and the antiphons got longer and more elaborate. And so what you end up with is basically an antiphon and maybe one verse of the psalm, and then we're done. So in a way, the verses of many of the psalms fell away and were replaced primarily by the antiphon. And you can say, well, this is lamentable or whatever, but these melodies were beautiful and all. But you're right; it meant that a lot of the verses went away, and also the ability of the people to sing or recite. In this case, it would be singing. These elaborate things became almost impossible. So, but this influenced then the shrinking of this text to basically an antiphon and maybe one verse of the psalm. And this is what we had in the church for over 1,000 years, up until about 1965 and through 1970, when the changes of the liturgy came, and there was a decision to go back to the older, I would argue, more ancient form of the liturgy, in this case, that would have the antiphon and a number of verses of the psalms sung. And the antiphons would be shorter and simpler and straightforward. However, the option remains today that one is able to use those old graduals and sing them in place of the psalm. And again, this is it's an option. And because they're hard to sing, even by trained singers these days, it tends to be something that usually isn't done, at least not in the newer form of liturgy. If you go to the old Latin Mass, however, that's what's used, the gradual. And again, you need a pretty well-trained schola or choir to be able to pull them off, so they're not easy. A second factor in terms of the sort of truncation of the responsorial psalm over the centuries seems to have been the dropping of the Old Testament reading. For various reasons that we discussed a little bit of in the last video and flyer, the Old Testament reading seems to have fallen away in the Western Rite. And so what we were left with was a reading from an epistle, usually of St. Paul, one of his letters, and a gospel. And between the two, there would be that short gradual, and then there would be an Alleluia with a verse and the gospel. So the dropping of the Old Testament readings tended to also create this idea that the Old Testament psalm, as a reply to the first reading, no longer really had the importance. So for all these reasons, the responsorial psalm that we know today and that was known in the very ancient church tended to drop away, got shorter, but the antiphon itself grew longer and more elaborate. And that's what happened. That was changed right around 1965 to 1970. We went back to the older way. Okay, now look, let's take just maybe a couple of thoughts, pastoral reflections on this for a moment. It's true to say, as I said earlier in this video, that the psalm is, quote, another reading, but as I said, it's more than just another reading. I like to sometimes say we have four readings in the Mass: one from the Old Testament, the Psalm, the Epistle, and the Gospel. So it is a reading, but it is more than a reading. It's meant to be a rejoicing, if you will, in the Old Testament reading that was just proclaimed. So the Old Testament is done, and then as a joyful reply, response, the faithful are encouraged to join in to the degree possible into a psalm that is said or sung, at least by reciting or singing the antiphon. And this is meant to be, again, a joyful response. It's a song, but it's also a reading. It's a reading, but it's also a song. It's both. All right, so we see that. Now, the second thing I want to say, though, is that the term responsorial psalm is not given because there's a response or an antiphon. Most people think that's why it's called that. But rather, no. The response referred to here is to the reflection of the assembly or the people of God on the proclamation of the reading of the Old Testament that's just taken place. So you see, the bottom line is that the psalm is meant to be a prayerful response to the Old Testament reading. It often has a similar theme to the reading, and it points forward to the gospel that's usually linked to the Old Testament, and it's all woven together as a thoughtful, prayerful reply. And so the bottom line, y'all, is you're supposed to pray. See, often we just go through these things sort of as emotion rather than as a prayer. And the vision here is stop. Think about this reading we just heard proclaimed. Enter into a musical meditation on it, or at least a recited meditation that sort of sets the keynote. So, for example, there's a Sunday, maybe like an Epiphany, where the Old Testament reading talks about the gospel going to all the nations. And then the psalm response says something like, "Let all the nations praise you, O Lord." And then there's psalms. There's a psalm of the all the nations by the Magi coming to the Lord, coming to Jerusalem. So we see a lot of links there, and of course we know that in the gospel the Magi will come, the Gentiles will come to meet Christ near Jerusalem in Bethlehem. And so all this is tied together in that psalm, "Let all the nations praise you, O Lord." That's our prayerful response. It's not just another reading or recitation. So don't forget to pray. All right, enough said then on the responsorial psalm. As you can see, it's gone through some stages that largely have been restored from we do the most ancient practice today, namely this idea of an antiphon sung or said by the people, verses of the psalm read by a lector or sung by a cantor, and there's this back and forth quality. That's the way it began, and that's where we have it now. In between, it tended to get shortened, and it was turned into more of just an antiphon and maybe one verse from the psalm. And now it's been re-elaborated again, all right? And that's where we are today with it. But again, it's a reading, but it's also a song. It's a song, and it's also a reading, and it's both. And it's meant to be a joyful, prayerful response to the readings that are, and weave them together and kind of hold them together like a bow, kind of a bow that holds the readings together. All right, blessings, and we'll see you in the next installment.